So it's obviously all kicking off again in the Straits. Bad times, bad times for everyone. But with Douglas Macgregor was on Dan Davis again. Very interesting, worth a watch.
The Iranians have been very clear. There will be no nuclear deal if Lebanon is evacuated, if it is not evacuated, if the war does not end. There will be no nuclear negotiations if this does not take place. So that's really up to the Americans. And in addition to that, the Iranians can make life for the Americans much more difficult in the Strait of Hormuz. If the Americans refrain from carrying out their obligations elsewhere, then the Iranians will feel that they are not obliged to allow all that many ships to pass through.
And that's actually what they're doing right now. But that's President Trump's primary political requirement: no nuclear weapons, et cetera. But he's saying it, and it's so weird because the Iranian side has always said we aren't going after nuclear weapons. So that's easy. We'll declare that and whatever. We'll negotiate that after these other things are done. But now they're saying we won't even start that process unless this happens. And so, Doug, I mean, tell me if you'd see it differently, but if that is truly the position of the Iranian government, there won't be any negotiations at all because Israel will never do what was required.
Well, from the standpoint privately of people in Washington and Israel, is very much the same. This nuclear business is almost a distraction. In fact, I would say it's a major strategic distraction. If you go back and look at the comments that were made before and immediately after the first major round of war that began in February and then concluded, I would argue, I guess at least temporarily before July. What was the focus? What did people talk about? They say, well, nuclear weapons, yeah, that's important, but it's really the ballistic missile arsenal. It's Iran's ability to threaten Israel. And that's the problem. What Morandi says is not wrong, but he needs to understand something. There is only one acceptable outcome for Israel in this war, and that is the complete destruction of Iran. Just as the only outcome right now that satisfies people in Kiev, and for that matter, in the globalist elites, not the populations of Europe, but the globalist elites, is the destruction of Russia. Just as they wanted to carve up Russia into smaller pieces, rape it and exploit it for its resources, that's exactly what the people in Washington and in Israel want to do to Iran. That has not changed. Now, the other issue on nuclear weaponry is as follows. If you were really all that concerned about preventing people from developing and fielding nuclear weapons, don't attack them. But that never really occurred to anybody because it really wasn't at the top of the agenda. Remember, the Israelis would probably welcome any excuse they could find to launch a nuclear weapon at Iran. And we would probably sit there and applaud. Fine, great, go ahead and do it. Don't wait for anybody in the United States to wake up, smell the coffee, and understand the utter insanity and folly of all of this. Don't expect anybody to take note of the views of the rest of the world, let alone the Chinese and the Russians. It's not going to happen. Nobody cares. Nobody gives a damn. So what are we dealing with? We're dealing with the Keens of the world, obedient servants of the Jewish lobby in the United States, well paid for their trouble, well paid for their efforts, richly rewarded for everything they say and do. And they are going to flog this horse until it's dead. That's Iran. So having said that, what is Professor Morandi's answer? Build more missiles, strengthen your defenses, get ready for the worst, because it's coming. I don't think Iran has much choice in that matter.
And the whole thing is a distraction if you think about it. Do you know what I mean? It's like they've went to war. Israel begged America to join the war. We need to defeat Iran. They're a threat to us. But then look what they're doing in Lebanon. How are they mobilizing troops all over the region? The West Bank, Lebanon. How are they doing that? If this is their existential threat, it's nonsense, like absolute nonsense. And the more people are waking up to it, the better, like. But we'll just jump back into Doug here, he's got another part about Trump.
We're not going anywhere. And Donald Trump, the big disappointment with Donald Trump is as follows. If you go back, and it's not just a question of looking at what he was saying before he was elected, but let's look at what he's done since he arrived. What has he really succeeded in fundamentally changing? And I think the answer is nothing. Arguably, one of the keystones in the edifice of success that he was trying to build was the simple passage of legislation on voter integrity. I mean, it's hard to imagine any country in the world that would say we don't want every citizen that comes to vote on election day to show their identity, lest we should discover they are American citizens. Instead, we don't want to demand anything of anybody. And effectively, we're leaving that into the laps of the states. So there's no voter integrity. If there's no voter integrity, how meaningful are elections? If elections aren't meaningful, what does that say about the republic? Now you would think that what I just described would be at the top of Donald Trump's list of critical tasks to be performed. Have you heard him say a lot about that lately? Not really. I think he's walked away from these things that were vitally important to the survival of our republic, and instead is focused on all the things that are important to his donors, to the donor class, the globalists that currently govern the West. What else do you want to call them besides donors and globalists? Zionists, neocons, the Epstein class. I mean, use whatever you want, all lump them together. They're the people that are driving this train. They could care less about elections. They could care less about the electorate. They don't care who shows up or doesn't show up. They're in control. That's the problem. And President Trump has done nothing to change that.
Nothing at all, like, and this is what we need to realise. It doesn't matter who you elect. It's the same here in the UK, in England. Conservative, Reform, Labour. It doesn't matter, like. They're all pissing the same pot. It's all for the people at the top of the totem pole. Never ever forget that. This is what we need to realise, like.
Nor do I expect that he will in the near future.
Yeah, and that leaves us in a big conundrum. I mean, if we just ended the show right there, it's a pretty bleak outlook here. Unfortunately, there's another side to this whole problem here. And you mentioned war to the last missile. Well, that doesn't just apply in the Middle East. That also applies in the Russia-Ukraine war. And in fact, that seems to be something that Volodymyr Zelensky wants to help accelerate because he's really keenly interested in those missiles.
Недостатньо засобів захисту. Особливо це стосується ракет для Петріотів. Ми усім партнерам довели і потребу, і головне можливість, як можна дати більше захисту життя. Це просто нонсенс, що в сучасному світі виробництво ще не налагоджено, настільки не налагоджено, наскільки реально треба, щоб був захист людей від балістичного терору. Ми давно зверталися і довели, що можемо виробляти, зокрема, і таку номенклатуру захисної зброї, якби Україна отримала від Америки ліцензії на виробництво Петріотів, нашого виробництва вистачало би і на захист України, і на допомогу партнерам, які цього.
So he's saying, and he has said in the previous few days, look, to all of NATO, forget about this 2027, because apparently there's already some contracts to give them some Patriots in 2027 that have yet to be built. He said, you know what, forget about all that. Give me all of them that you have right now, and then give me this additional ability to manufacture going forward in my country here. What do you think of that idea?
Well, he's also mentioning something else that I think is worth noting. In the context of what he was discussing, he was saying, what is wrong that the Western world is not adequately mobilized, its industry, its capabilities, its forces to support me, Zelensky. Now, you know, I've never been a supporter of this man. He, like everything else associated with the Ukrainian war, is a fraud. I mean, this is someone, Kolomoisky, a famous Jewish oligarch from Russia, who then moved into Ukraine and established himself and made billions. He's now, I guess, sitting in jail somewhere. He's the one that found Zelensky, who grew up speaking only Russian, who was a comedian, not a Ukrainian ethnically and certainly not by birth, and puts him in charge of Ukraine. with the help, of course, of the Newlands and Kagans and others. Now, these people created this fictitious government, and we have been backing it to the hilt thanks to the CIA and the United Kingdom's MI6. And he's saying, look, you put me here. I was willing to try and get out of this with a peace agreement. You sent in Boris Yeltsin. He promised me the world. You haven't delivered. And what he's really saying is, if you don't give me everything now, I'm not going to be here in another year. And he's correct. He is absolutely correct. Now, there's something else that is never mentioned. That is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint. He's always been opposed to any action that might result in the sudden introduction of NATO forces into the equation. He doesn't want a major war. He's handled that very well. But things are getting rough right now in this war, in the sense that the Russian people certainly have run out of patience. But we need to remember that President Putin also has enormous influence in Venezuela, in Cuba, even in Mexico. He has enormous enormous amount of influence in many countries. He could escalate the conflict that we've got going right now in Ukraine against him, and for that matter, what we're doing in the Middle East to destroy Iran, and move this horizontally into the Western Hemisphere. We are lucky that we've got President Putin on the other side of this equation. The problem is, somewhere along the line, President Trump seemed to promise some degree of flexibility, understanding, or agreement in Alaska. That turned out to be a complete and utter fraud. And I think that's begun to really change the situation and the attitude in Moscow towards us. It's not simply, we can't believe in anything the Americans say. They're really the enemy too, just as much as the people in Europe. I think that's very dangerous, and that's why it's not impossible that we could see dramatic events over the next several months. The assumption that the Russians will sit quietly, gradually bite off pieces of their enemy. Now we've got these fortress cities that are falling, but not move beyond that, I think is a mistake. I think it's very dangerous. This is a more dangerous period right now than perhaps any that we've seen to this point. So I don't know which particular conflict blows up in our faces first, whether it's Iran or Ukraine, and I don't exclude trouble in the Caribbean with Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico.
And this is the thing, this is what people need to understand. The elites, the Epstein class, the Zionists, and don't get it twisted, I'm not being anti-Semitic. All Jews aren't Zionists, and all Zionists aren't Jews. There's a lot of evangelical Christian Zionists. They're not happy with 99%. They want 100%. They want the globe, and they won't stop. People need to realise, it's a dangerous game they're playing. And we're complicity in the UK. We've got factories building drones, parts for drones getting sent to Ukraine under international law. Putin would be well within his rights. This, honestly, dark times ahead, dark times ahead.